So, in 1851, the British built a palace entirely out of glass, basically to just prove to the rest of the planet that they had essentially conquered the world.
Right, the famous Crystal Palace.
Yeah, exactly. And if you stood inside it, bathed in all this sunlight, surrounded by the greatest technological marvels of the age, you would have felt this absolute, unshakable certainty that humanity had finally figured everything out.
It was peak utopian optimism.
Totally. But then, less than 50 years later, the absolute greatest artistic genius of that exact same society was rotting away in a windowless, suffocating stone dungeon, writing about how the entire moral fabric of the universe had just completely collapsed.
It's arguably the most dramatic psychological pivot in modern history.
Yeah. So today, we are figuring out exactly how an entire civilization's mindset went into a complete freefall in just a single lifetime.
Because we're talking about a society dropping from the absolute heights of, industrial arrogance straight down into the darkest, most cynical depths of despair.
And the roadmap for that collapse isn't found in their government documents or anything boring like that. It's actually found in their poetry.
Which is what makes it so fascinating to study.
Exactly. So welcome to this deep dive. If you are listening to this right now because you are studying for a massive exam on Victorian literature, or you have a term paper due, or maybe you're just intensely curious about how cultural psychology actually works, you are in exactly the right place.
We have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do.
Yeah.
We are going to trace the grand arc of the 19th century today. But we aren't just going to give you some dry list of dates and rhyming schemes because that's boring.
No one wants that.
Right. We are going to look at the poetry of this era as a psychological X-ray of the Victorian mind. We're going to see how people cope when their religion fails, how artists rebel against society, and what happens when the floor just totally drops out on everything you believe in.
To really understand that sheer panic, though, and the dark psychology of the later poets like Robert Browning or Oscar Wilde, you first have to understand the baseline they were starting from.
The bedrock, basically.
Exactly. You have to understand the psychological bedrock of the mid-19th century. And that bedrock was made of supreme, almost arrogant complacency.
Which brings us back to that glass palace, the 1851 Great Exhibition.
Right.
I mean, London at this moment isn't just a city. It genuinely feels like the hub of mankind. The Industrial Revolution has matured, railways have completely rewired the concept of time and distance, and they've generated a level of wealth that is, frankly, unprecedented in human history.
It really was. And it wasn't just wealth for the aristocracy either. The middle class was exploding.
Yeah.
The Great Exhibition brought together objects of art, raw materials, and these massive, thundering steam engines from across the globe, all under one gigantic glass roof in Hyde Park.
It's just wild to picture.
It was a physical manifestation of the idea that progress was not just possible, but scientifically inevitable.
And you can actually hear the rhythm of that industrial optimism in the poetry of the time. Like, look at the poet laureate Alfred, Lord Tennyson.
Oh, Locksley Hall.
Yes. He wrote Locksley Hall, and there was the very famous couplet in there where he writes, "Let the great world spin forever down the ringing grooves of change."
The ringing grooves.
Right. He is literally writing about the feeling of riding in one of the very first trains from Liverpool to Birmingham. He's equating the physical, metallic momentum of a locomotive with the unstoppable moral and economic progress of humanity.
Though, it's worth noting that while they had this unbounded faith in their economic machinery, they were actually somewhat artistically adrift.
Oh, totally.
That immense industrial output created this bizarre aesthetic lag.
Yeah, I was looking at the descriptions of Victorian homes from this period, and it honestly sounds like a nightmare.
It was pretty cluttered.
Cluttered is an understatement. They had all this new wealth, and they basically just wanted to prove they had it by stuffing it into their furniture. Like, the light, elegant wooden chairs of the 18th century were suddenly being heavily upholstered, puffed up, covered in fringe.
Just massive, heavy, red brick and cement houses everywhere.
Yeah, it's like they equated physical density with moral seriousness.
That's a great way to put it. And you add to that the invention of photography, which was just coming into its own.
Right, which totally messed up the painters.
Completely. Suddenly, traditional portrait painters were entirely confused about their role. I mean, if a camera can capture reality perfectly, what is the point of a painting?
Exactly.
So they were technologically advanced, but philosophically and aesthetically, they were floundering. But, and this is key, that aesthetic clumsiness was held together by a much stronger glue.
The religion.
Yes, a very specific, very rigid religious foundation.
evangelicalism.
Yeah.
It permeated absolutely everything. It didn't matter if you're Anglican, Methodist, or Catholic. The overarching culture was ruled by a literal, unyielding belief in the Bible, a strict sense of duty, and this total obsession with proper conduct.
It was inescapable.
You look at the massive bestsellers of the day, and it wasn't just novels. In 1859, a guy named Samuel Smiles publishes a book quite literally called Self-Help.
And it was an absolute blockbuster.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It sold 120,000 copies almost instantly. He even followed it up with sequels titled Character, Thrift, and Duty.
Wow.
The public just had this insatiable appetite for moral instruction. Even children in Sunday schools were reciting rhymes like, A is for angel who praises the Lord. B stands for Bible that teaches God's word.
So it was a society wrapped in this very tight, very warm blanket of absolute certainty.
Perfectly said.
But then we hit 1859, and the blanket basically catches fire.
It really does.
This is the watershed moment. This is when the cracks in that foundation don't just show, the whole thing splits wide open. Because 1859 is the year Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species.
The impact of Darwin, it really cannot be overstated. Overnight, the literal truth of the biblical creation story.
The whole Adam and Eve thing.
Right. The idea that humans were a special divine creation crafted in the image of God, it is thrown into severe, scientifically backed doubt.
But what really blew my mind looking at the history here is that it wasn't just biology attacking the church, it was historians too, right?
Yes. There was this movement coming out of Germany called the higher criticism.
Okay, yes. Let's talk about higher criticism because this is absolutely crucial.
It is. Scholars like David Friedrich Strauss were applying rigorous archaeological and historical analysis to the text of the Bible itself.
It was revolutionary.
Very.
Yeah.
His book, The Life of Jesus, Critically Examined, was actually translated into English by the novelist George Eliot.
So explain the core argument of higher criticism for us. Because to a Victorian listener, this must have sounded like pure, unadulterated blasphemy.
Oh, it was treated as such by many. Strauss argued that the Gospels were not historical eyewitness accounts of miracles.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he said they were more of a mythic accumulation. He posited that the Bible was an evolutionary growth of primitive mythology.
Okay, so what about Jesus?
He argued that Christ was simply an ordinary historical figure. Perhaps a compelling teacher, sure, but fundamentally a deluded mortal man, not a divine being who resurrected from the dead.
Wow. So put yourself in the shoes of a mid-century Victorian, right? Your cutting-edge science is suddenly telling you that you are basically just an evolved ape, and your top historians are telling you that your savior was just a regular guy who died and stayed dead.
The spiritual whiplash must have been agonizing.
It must have been. And you see this exact panic in Tennyson's poetry. In his masterwork, In Memoriam, he goes from cheering for the ringing grooves of change to writing this incredibly vulnerable stanza.
Which one?
He writes, I falter where I firmly trod, and falling with my weight of cares upon the great world's altar stairs that slope through darkness up to God. I stretch lame hands of faith and grope.
Oh, lame hands of faith.
Yeah.
It is a stunning admission of spiritual defeat. The confident, muscular Christianity of the early century has literally been reduced to a blind man groping in the dark on the altar stairs.
The certainty was just gone.
And as if losing their religion wasn't enough, right on the heels of that, they lose their geopolitical invincibility.
Yeah.
Everything falls apart at once.
Pretty much. The political complacency comes to a crashing halt around 1870. The Battle of Sedan takes place, where rapidly modernizing Prussia absolutely decimates France.
And suddenly you have Germany.
Yes, suddenly a unified militaristic Germany emerges as an industrial superpower, directly threatening British supremacy.
Plus, there are all these economic threats. Back in 1846, Britain repealed the Corn Laws, basically betting the house on free trade. But by the 1870s, because of the expansion of railways in the U.S. and new steamships, incredibly cheap foreign grain is just flooding English markets.
British agriculture goes into a massive depression.
Exactly. The assumption that free trade would magically benefit England forever just evaporates.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
You know, it makes me think of the early days of the internet. Like that 1851 Great Exhibition feels exactly like a Silicon Valley Tech Expo in, say, 2010.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, because everyone there assumes that software and social media are automatically going to create world peace, topple dictators, and make everyone rich. There's this arrogant faith in the algorithm of human progress, you know.
Yes, the blind optimism.
Right, and then a decade later, reality hits, the systems are weaponized, and the optimism just vanishes.
That is a perfect modern parallel. The technological tools do not guarantee moral stability. But this massive loss of faith, both religious and economic, leaves us with a critical psychological question.
Which is,
Humans generally cannot tolerate a vacuum of meaning. So, if the literal faith in the Bible was shattered, what filled the void?
imperialism.
Exactly.
I mean, when you look at the literature of the late 19th century, it's so clear they took all that evangelical energy and just redirected it.
When the literal belief in a deity vanished, the strict Victorian concept of duty remained. It just mutated into a secularized geopolitical crusade.
Which is terrifying.
It is. You see this perfectly encapsulated in the poetry of Rudyard Kipling.
Right, Kipling's The White Man's Burden from 1899. It reads exactly like a missionary's call to action. But instead of saving souls for the kingdom of heaven, it's about conquering and civilizing foreign nations for the British Empire.
It's deeply problematic.
He calls conquered peoples half devil and half child. It's horrific.
Yeah.
But psychologically, you can see exactly what he's doing, right? He's using the cadence of religion to justify colonization.
And in his famous poem Recessional, which was written for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, he repeatedly uses the refrain, "Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget."
It sounds so desperate.
It is. It is the haunting cry of a society that has lost its authentic faith in God, but desperately wants to hold on to the earthly power and moral superiority that the faith used to justify. It's basically the hollow shell of religion propping up an empire.
Okay, so that is the macro environment. The world is changing way too fast, the old rules are dead, and outward certainty is just crumbling.
Yes.
And when the external world stops making sense, artists tend to retreat into the internal world. They go inside the human mind. And that pivot is entirely embodied by one man,
Robert Browning.
Robert Browning.
He is arguably the perfect poet for an age of psychological complexity and doubt. He completely reinvented how a poem could operate. But to understand his method, we have to look at his rather unique upbringing.
Yeah, born in 1812 in Camberwell, right outside London. The most vital detail for anyone studying Browning is his education, because he didn't have a traditional public school background at all.
Not even close.
He was educated almost entirely at home, specifically in his father's personal library, which contained over 6,000 books.
It's astounding.
We're talking rare Greek texts, Latin histories, obscure medieval treatises. His brain was basically a supercomputer trained on a ridiculously dense diet of niche history.
And as a teenager, he deeply idolized the Romantic poets, especially Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Oh, he was obsessed.
Browning was so taken with him that he adopted Shelley's radical liberalism, his vegetarianism, and even his atheism. He referred to Shelley as the sun treader.
Though his mother, who was a very devout nonconformist, eventually panicked at the atheism and pulled him back into the religious fold.
Thankfully for his family, yes.
But he always kept that rebellious, intense energy. And of course, we can't talk about Browning without talking about the romance. It's basically the greatest literary love story of the 19th century.
Elizabeth Barrett. At the time they met in 1845, she was vastly more famous and successful than he was.
Massively more successful. But she was essentially a prisoner in her own home.
It's such a tragic setup.
It really is. She was an invalid, dealing with chronic illness, living in a darkened room in London, and completely controlled by this tyrannical father who explicitly forbade any of his 12 children from ever getting married.
But then Browning reads her poetry, she praises his, and he writes her this incredibly bold letter stating, "I love your verses with all my heart, dear Miss Barrett, and I love you too."
Just going for it.
He really did. What follows is this clandestine courtship. He visits her when her father's out of the house. She writes a series of poems chronicling her hesitant, then overwhelming love for him, which she titled Sonnets from the Portuguese.
And the Portuguese was Browning's private, affectionate nickname for her, right? Because of her dark complexion.
Exactly. And in 1846, they elope. They flee to Italy.
It's a total triumph. Her health miraculously improves in the Mediterranean climate. They have a son, and she goes on to write Aurora Leigh, which is this massive epic poem about an independent female artist that Virginia Woolf later called a masterpiece.
It's a brilliant work.
But while Browning's personal life was a fairy tale, his early professional life was kind of a disaster.
It was. Early in his career, Browning wrote a poem called Pauline. It was a very traditional romantic poem, deeply emotional, highly subjective, essentially just Browning spilling his own intense feelings and neuroses onto the page.
And then the great philosopher and critic John Stuart Mill got his hands on a copy.
Oh, this is brutal.
Mill wrote a private critique that essentially destroyed Browning. Mill said the author possessed a more intense and morbid self-consciousness than I ever knew in any sane human being.
He basically called him an unbearable narcissist.
Which is such a burn. And that critique terrified Browning. He realized that bleeding his own emotions onto the page was amateurish and painfully vulnerable, so he executed a radical pivot.
He declared that his poetry would no longer be subjective confession. Instead, he would focus on what he called action in character, rather than character in action.
Action in character. Let's really pin that down for a second.
Sure.
He didn't want to write epics about knights swinging swords and slaying dragons. That's character in action.
Yeah.
He wanted to write about the gears turning inside a person's head while they justify doing something terrible. He wanted to map the psychological machinery of human beings.
But before he perfected that technique, he made one of the most infamous miscalculations in English literary history.
Here we go.
The publication of Sordello in 1840.
Oh, Sordello. If you were writing a paper on Browning, you have to mention this train wreck. It is a 5,800-line poem about a completely obscure 13th century Italian troubadour.
It's so dense.
And it is so aggressively confusing that it ruined Browning's reputation for 2 solid decades. People thought it was a practical joke. Tennyson famously said he only understood the first line and the last line, and they were both lies.
The failure of Sordello really lies in that 6,000-book library we mentioned earlier.
Oh, so?
Well, Browning possessed this encyclopedic knowledge of medieval Italian politics, the Guelph and Ghibelline factions, warlords like Parella-Selinguera, and he wrongly assumed his readers shared this knowledge.
Oh, no.
So he provided zero context. He just dropped them into the middle of this dense, chaotic, historical tapestry.
But why on earth would a guy whose stated goal is to capture human psychology write a 6,000-line poem about a medieval politician nobody knows? That seems totally counterintuitive.
Because he was trying to trace the entire psychological development of a soul against the backdrop of massive historical forces. He was just trying to do way too much at once.
Gotcha.
However, what's fascinating is that while the Victorians absolutely despised it, decades later, the pioneer of modernist poetry, Ezra Pound, became obsessed with Sordello.
Wait, really?
Yes. Pound saw it as the blueprint for complex, multi-layered, modernist, epic poetry.
But Pound also had a really specific, brilliant critique of how Browning actually wrote it, right? The cameo versus intaglio method. Let's break this down because it perfectly explains the mechanics of poetry.
Absolutely. In sculpture or engraving, the intaglio method is when the artist carves into the material to create a design. You dig grooves into the stone.
So the artist's presence is very obvious. You can feel the pressure of their tools.
Exactly. The cameo method, on the other hand, is when the artist carefully chips away the background material, allowing the subject to stand out in relief, seemingly on its own.
So to translate that into writing, Pound felt that in Sordello, Browning was using the intaglio method. He was digging too hard into the material.
Yes.
He was constantly intruding, constantly steering the reader, rather than just using the cameo method, stepping back, removing the background, and letting the historical characters speak for themselves. Precisely. To use a modern analogy, intaglio is like watching a movie where the director insists on playing a voiceover commentary track the entire time, constantly explaining to you what the characters are thinking and why the scene matters.
It's overbearing.
It is.
Yes. And cameo is when the director just sits the camera down, yells action, and lets 2 brilliant actors play out a subtle, devastating scene, trusting the audience to figure out the subtext.
That's exactly it.
Browning's Sordello was a box office bomb because the director wouldn't shut up, but he learned from it. He realized he needed a tighter, more disciplined container for his psychological experiments. And that realization birthed his greatest invention, the dramatic monologue.
If Sordello was an unwieldy, sprawling mess, the dramatic monologue was a literary sniper rifle.
Let's explain exactly what a dramatic monologue is. It's a poem where a single character, who's definitely not the poet, is speaking to a silent listener at a critical moment in their life.
And the thrill of reading it is that the speaker is almost always unreliable, morally compromised, or straight up psychotic.
Right. You, the reader, have to act as a detective, reading between the lines to figure out the horrifying truth they are accidentally revealing about themselves.
And there is no finer example of this than Porphyria's Lover. Browning originally published this in a collection titled Madhouse Cells.
So right from the jump, he is telling the reader, You are about to enter the mind of a lunatic.
Exactly.
Let's walk through this poem because the pacing of it is essentially a modern true crime thriller. It opens on a dark, stormy night. The narrator is sitting in a freezing cottage, completely passive, almost catatonic. The wind is tearing at the elm trees outside.
Very Gothic setup.
Very. Then the door opens, and Porphyria glides in, and she immediately takes total control of the room. She shuts out the storm, she kneels at the grate, and she physically builds a blazing fire. She takes off her wet cloak, lets down her damp yellow hair, sits next to the narrator, and pulls his head down onto her bare shoulder.
She is the active, vital, dominant force in the room.
She murmurs that she loves him. The text implies she has temporarily overcome immense societal barriers, perhaps a difference in class or a pre-existing marriage, to brave the storm and be with him tonight.
And the narrator, who has not spoken a single word or moved a muscle this entire time, suddenly has a realization.
It's the most chilling pivot in 19th century literature. He looks up into her eyes, and he realizes that in this exact, fleeting second, she is perfectly pure, perfectly happy, and perfectly surrendered to him.
And his damaged brain decides that the only way to ensure this moment never fades, that she never leaves him, is to freeze time.
So he takes her long yellow hair, wraps it 3 times around her little throat, and strangles her to death.
The horror of the poem isn't just the murder, it's the clinical, detached tone of the speaker. The meter of the poem doesn't jump or fracture, it stays perfectly calm. He says, "No pain felt she. I am quite sure she felt no pain."
He literally untightens the hair, opens her dead eyes, and props her smiling, rosy little corpse head against his own shoulder. He reverses their position.
It's deeply disturbing.
It is. She was the active human holding him. Now she is a static, beautiful object that he completely possesses.
And he sits there with the corpse all night. But it is the very last line of the poem that reveals the true depths of his psychosis. He says, "And all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word."
Hold up. We really need to pause on that line. He murmurs that God hasn't said a word. Is he disappointed that he hasn't been punished, or is he feeling triumphant?
It's triumph, and this ties into a very specific theological concept that Browning was fascinated by, connected to a historical figure named Johannes Agricola. The concept is called antinomianism.
Okay, let's unpack antinomianism because that sounds incredibly dense. What does that actually mean in practice?
At its core, antinomianism is a radical, heretical extreme of Calvinist predestination. It is the belief that certain elect Christians are chosen by God for salvation before the beginning of time.
Okay, following so far.
Therefore, because their salvation is absolutely guaranteed, they are entirely exempt from earthly moral law.
Wait, so they genuinely believed that if they were one of the elect, they could lie, steal, or commit cold-blooded murder, and it literally wouldn't count as a sin. They believed they were above the law.
Exactly. It is the ultimate theological loophole. It breeds a terrifying solipsism.
Wow.
The narrator of Porphyria's lover commits a heinous act, and he sits there waiting for a lightning bolt. When the sky remains silent, when God doesn't immediately strike him down, he interprets that silence as divine endorsement. God hasn't punished me, therefore I was right to do it. I am a god of my own universe.
That is deeply unsettling. Browning isn't just writing a murder mystery. He is diagnosing the absolute extreme of patriarchal control, jealousy, and religious delusion.
Yes, he is.
And he uses this exact same dramatic monologue format to dissect a completely different but equally corrupt mindset in the Adalogy. The bishop orders his tomb at St. Praxed's Church.
If Porphyria's lover is about the terrifying silence of a cold, solitary cottage, the bishop orders his tomb is about the loud, colorful, hypocritical splendor of the Italian Renaissance.
The setup here is fantastic. We have a Catholic bishop on his deathbed. He's surrounded by his nephews, who he immediately, in a feverish moment of honesty, admits are actually his illegitimate sons.
So right away, the vow of celibacy is out the window.
Exactly. He is dying, supposedly about to meet his maker, but his entire monologue is consumed by one thing: intense, petty, worldly materialism.
He's obsessed with a man named Gandalf, a rival bishop who died before him. Gandalf managed to secure the best burial spot in the church, the southern corner.
But Gandalf's tomb is only made of onion stone, a cheap, flaky marble.
Right. And our dying bishop is desperate to humiliate his rival from beyond the grave by forcing his sons to build him a vastly superior, incredibly expensive monument.
He is trying to bribe his own children. He's promising them villas and horses if they build his tomb out of jasper, basalt, and rare peach blossom marble.
He even confesses that years ago, when his church caught fire, he rescued a massive, priceless lump of lapis lazuli.
And instead of giving it back to the church, he buried it in his vineyard. Now he wants it dug up and placed right between the knees of his effigy, just so Gandalf's corpse will burst with envy.
The brilliance of Browning here is how he maps the fragmentation of the bishop's dying mind. The bishop's brain is a total jumble of the sacred and the profane.
Yes, the epitaph he wants carved on the tomb. He tells his sons it must be in choice Latin, specifically the pure, elegant, classical Latin of Cicero.
He is terrified they will carve it in the degraded late Empire Latin of Ulpian, which is what Gandalf has on his tomb.
And then he describes the frieze he wants carved around the base of the monument. He wants a statue of Moses holding the Ten Commandments right next to a classical nymph having her clothes ripped off by a satyr.
Alongside Jesus delivering the Sermon on the Mount, right next to a struggling lynx, which is a pagan symbol of Dionysus.
It is the ultimate mashup of Christian theology and pagan sensuality. Now, a listener might read this and ask, is Browning, as an English Protestant, just writing cheap anti-Catholic propaganda here? Is he just making a caricature of a corrupt priest?
That's a fair question, but it's much deeper than that. John Ruskin, arguably the most important art critic of the Victorian era, read this poem and declared that Browning had captured the entire essence of the Renaissance in a few pages.
High praise.
Ruskin wrote that the poem perfectly distills the era's worldliness, inconsistency, pride, hypocrisy, ignorance of itself, love of art, of luxury, and of good Latin.
So Browning is using this corrupt bishop to explore a universal human flaw. He's showing how human nature, our petty jealousies, our obsession with beautiful objects, our desperate need to be better than our neighbors, persists right up to our final breath.
The bishop is a man of God who has been completely hollowed out by aesthetics.
And speaking of aesthetics, Browning didn't just use his monologues to analyze murderers and priests. He also used them to deeply explore the agonizing struggle of being an artist.
And no poem captures the sheer nightmarish difficulty of the creative process quite like Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came.
This poem is wild. It reads like dark fantasy. It was written in a single day in Paris in 1852. Browning made a New Year's resolution to write a poem every day, and this just poured out of him.
The title and the inspiration come from a single, obscure line spoken by a character pretending to be mad in Shakespeare's King Lear, mixed with imagery from a nursery rhyme about Jack the Giant Killer.
Browning always maintained that he had no conscious allegorical intention when he wrote it. He claimed it was just a vision that presented itself to him.
But the psychological landscape he paints is so vivid, so oppressive, that it practically demands interpretation.
Let's put the listener in this landscape. Our protagonist, Roland, is a knight on a quest for the Dark Tower. He starts by asking for directions from a hoary cripple with a malicious, mocking eye.
Roland knows this old man is lying to him, trying to lead him to his death, but Roland is so exhausted by his lifelong quest that he takes the path anyway.
And the environment he walks into is a vision of total ecological and spiritual death.
The descriptions are deeply unsettling. The grass grows as scantily as hair in leprosy. The ground looks like it's been kneaded up with blood. It is a wasteland that aggressively hates life.
He sees a blind, starving, stiff horse that looks so miserable. Roland thinks it must have been thrust out of the devil's own stud. He has to cross a spiteful black river, and as he wades in, he is terrified he's going to step on a dead man's face hidden in the mud.
And he spears a water rat, and Browning writes that the rat let out a sound like a baby's shriek.
It is pure, concentrated horror.
He even stumbles upon a bizarre, rusted machine lying in the mud, a brake or a harrow that looks like an engine of torture meant to reel men's bodies out like silk.
Just a landscape of profound failure, torment, and isolation.
Yeah.
So how do we interpret this?
If you're a student trying to write a thesis on this, the best angle is to read it as a poem about the poet's own ascesis.
Ascesis, let's define that. It means severe self-discipline, often involving self-denial and rigorous struggle, usually for spiritual or artistic goals.
Right. Remember, Browning is 40 years old when he writes this. He is largely unrecognized. The public still mocks him for Sordello.
He is known primarily in literary circles just as Elizabeth Barrett's husband.
Exactly. Roland's grueling journey through this wasteland of dead knights and rusted torture engines is a metaphor for Browning's own journey through the literary world, enduring bad reviews, public misunderstanding, and the creeping fear that he has wasted his entire life on a failed quest.
The machine of torture represents the agonizing critical systems he had to endure. But it is the climax of the poem that is so remarkable.
Roland finally reaches the Dark Tower. It is described as a squat, blind, round building.
The trap shuts behind him. He is surrounded by the ghosts of all the other knights who failed before him. They are all watching him, waiting for his doom. He is facing absolute, undeniable annihilation.
But what does he do? He doesn't surrender. He doesn't collapse. He takes his slughorn, a term Browning actually borrowed from an 18th century poet named Thomas Chatterton, who ironically committed suicide after failing as an artist.
Right. Roland puts the horn to his lips and he blows it. Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came.
It is a breathtaking act of defiance. It is the artist staring into the abyss of failure and oblivion and deciding to make art anyway. It's a triumphant assertion of identity in the face of doom.
It's basically Browning saying, the critics might destroy me, history might forget me, but I am going to write my poetry exactly the way I want to.
And he explores this exact same theme of artistic rebellion from a much more humorous historical angle in the poem Fra Lippi.
Fra Lippi is a brilliant historical monologue based on Giorgio Vasari's famous Renaissance text Lives of the Artists. Lippi was a real historical painter in 15th century Florence.
And his backstory is crucial. He wasn't some pious spiritual ascetic. He was an orphan starving on the streets until his aunt basically dumped him at a Carmelite monastery when he was 8 years old, just so he would have food.
He takes the vows to become a monk, but his personality is entirely unsuited for it. He loves rich food, he loves drinking, and he really, really loves women.
The poem opens with Lippi having literally tied his bedsheets together to sneak out of the window of his wealthy patron, Cosimo de' Medici, to go chase women in the red light district of Florence.
And he's caught by the night watchman, and the entire poem is him talking a mile a minute, trying to talk his way out of being arrested.
And in the process, he delivers a profound manifesto on the purpose of art.
He starts ranting about the rigid rules his monastic superiors force upon him. The medieval tradition of art, championed by painters like Fra Angelico, demanded that painting must be entirely spiritual.
It was supposed to ignore the physical body.
The monks explicitly tell Lippi, paint the soul, never mind the legs and arms. They want pale, ethereal saints that inspire prayer.
But Lippi rebels against this. He possesses a ravenous appetite for the physical world. He argues passionately for realism. He says, why can't the physical world be beautiful and spiritual?
He delivers one of the most famous lines in Victorian poetry. This world's no blot for us. It means intensely. It means good. To find its meaning is my meat and drink.
He argues that capturing the exact likeness of a face, the specific curve of a jaw, the exact texture of a velvet dress, is a way of honoring God's creation.
He says that when people see things painted beautifully, they actually notice the beauty of the real world for the very first time. Art opens their eyes to the reality they walk past every day.
It is a fierce defense of realism, but the metatextual layer here is what makes it a masterpiece.
Exactly. Browning, a 19th century English poet, is using a 15th century Italian painter as a mouthpiece to defend his own poetic style.
Browning's poetry is gritty realism.
He paints the warts, the twisted psychology, the ugly details of characters like the bishop and Porphyria's lover, because he believes that looking unflinchingly at the real, flawed world is the only way to find truth.
Browning is using visual arts as an objective correlative for his literature. But what is truly serendipitous is that right around the time Browning is publishing these poems about rebellious, realistic painters, a group of young, angry Victorian artists are doing the exact same thing in real life.
They realize they can do with a paintbrush exactly what Browning is doing with a pen.
Which brings us to the most visually stunning, rebellious movement of the era, the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood.
In 1848, a group of incredibly ambitious, very young British artists and poets decided they had had enough of the rigid, unimaginative rules of the British Royal Academy of Arts. The Academy was essentially the gatekeeper of all artistic success in England.
The primary founders were Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Holman Hunt, and John Everett Millais. They were all under 25 years old.
They formed a secret society. They started exhibiting their paintings anonymously, signing them only with the monogram PRB.
Their philosophy was literally embedded in their name. The Royal Academy idolized the high Renaissance painter Raphael. They taught that art should be highly idealized, mathematically proportioned, and elegantly composed.
The PRB hated this. They felt that after Raphael, art had become artificial and formulaic. They wanted to return to the style of Italian painting before Raphael.
They wanted the unadorned, naive, photographically precise truth of nature. If they painted a leaf, they didn't want to paint an idealized concept of a leaf. They wanted to paint every single vein and imperfection of a real leaf they found in a real forest.
And they applied this to human subjects too. When they painted religious scenes, they didn't paint glowing, ethereal saints. They painted ordinary, working-class people with dirt under their fingernails.
When their identities were discovered in 1850, the establishment absolutely lost its mind.
Charles Dickens, the most famous writer in the world at the time, launched a savage attack on them. He saw one of Millet's paintings of the Holy Family in a carpenter's shop, and Dickens was furious that Mary looked like an ordinary, tired working-class woman instead of a glowing queen of heaven.
He accused them of revolting ugliness.
But they were saved by John Ruskin. The same critic who understood Browning's Bishop stepped in and stoutly defended the Pre-Raphaelites, praising their absolute dedication to truth and nature.
And the most fascinating figure to emerge from this brotherhood, especially for our literary deep dive, is Dante Gabriel Rossetti. He was equally gifted as a painter and a poet, and he lived a life that was, frankly, more dramatic than most fiction.
His personal life was marked by extreme obsession and tragedy. He fell deeply in love with a woman named Elizabeth Siddal. She was originally a model for the Brotherhood.
In fact, she famously posed for Millet's iconic painting of Ophelia by lying in a bathtub full of freezing water for hours, which severely damaged her health.
Rossetti and Siddal had a tumultuous, obsessive relationship. They eventually married, but she suffered from chronic illness and severe depression. In 1862, she died from an overdose of laudanum, an opiate.
Rossetti was so stricken with grief and perhaps overwhelming guilt that he made a grand, macabre, romantic gesture.
He took the only complete manuscript of his unpublished poems and buried it inside her casket in Highgate Cemetery, intertwined in her famous red hair.
It's the ultimate tragic artist move, but the story doesn't end there.
Because 7 years later, Rossetti's painting career is stalling. He decides he wants to be known as a great poet, but all his best work is rotting 6 feet under.
So he allows his deeply unconventional agent, a man named Charles Augustus Howell, to go to Highgate Cemetery in the dead of night, dig up his wife's coffin, and retrieve the manuscript.
The exhumation deeply traumatized the highly superstitious Rossetti and contributed to his lifelong paranoia and insomnia.
But the poems were successfully published in 1870, and reading them, you can see why he went to such gruesome lengths to get them back.
You completely see it in his masterpiece, The Blessed Damozel. If you want to understand the Pre-Raphaelite aesthetic, this is the poem. It is essentially a deliberate, mirrored reversal of Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem, The Raven.
In The Raven, the earthly lover is trapped in his study, mourning the dead woman Lenore, who is supposedly at peace in heaven. Rossetti flips the camera.
Right, Rossetti puts the camera in heaven. The poem focuses on the dead woman, the damozel, looking down at earth, yearning for her lover who is still alive.
And true to the Pre-Raphaelite style, Rossetti paints this heavenly scene with hyper-precise, almost photographic visual detail.
He writes, "The blessed damozel leaned out from the gold bar of heaven. She had 3 lilies in her hand, and the stars in her hair were 7.
Notice the metrics of that. 3 lilies, 7 stars. It is exactly how a painter would balance a canvas. But the theology of the poem is what makes it so revolutionary and borderline heretical.
Traditional theology says heaven is a place of ultimate peace, where you shed your earthly desires and achieve perfect, blissful union with God. But this damozel is miserable.
The gold bar of heaven isn't a balcony. It acts like the bars of a prison.
She is surrounded by angels, but she is completely indifferent to them. She is weeping. She says heaven means nothing to her without the physical, earthly presence of her human lover.
It is a radical subversion of Victorian religious ideals. Rossetti is elevating human, romantic, physical love above spiritual salvation. Heaven is agonizing because it lacks physicality.
And this intense tension between the spiritual and the physical, the pure and the sensual, runs through the entire Pre-Raphaelite movement, which brings us to arguably the greatest poet of the family.
Christina Rossetti, Dante's sister, and her life could not have looked more different from her brother's.
While Dante was digging up graves and living a bohemian, scandalous lifestyle, Christina lived a very quiet, austere life. She was a devout, High Church Anglican.
She spent much of her time volunteering at a home for fallen women.
She was so strict in her faith that she actually broke off 2 separate engagements because the men didn't share her exact religious convictions.
But beneath that saint-like exterior, her poetry reveals a brilliant critical mind and a deeply sensuous temperament. And her masterpiece, published in 1862, is Goblin Market.
It is without a doubt one of the most complex, heavily debated poems of the 19th century. Let's dive into Goblin Market because on a superficial level, it reads like a children's fairy tale.
You have 2 innocent virginal sisters, Laura and Lizzie. They live together in a cottage. Every evening at twilight, they hear the call of the goblin men down in the glen, selling enchanted, magical fruit.
And Christina Rossetti's use of meter here is extraordinary. When the goblins are listing their fruits, the poem shifts into this rapid, breathless, dactylic meter.
Come buy our orchard fruits. Come buy, apples and quinces, lemons and oranges, plump, unpecked cherries. It mimics the tumbling, overwhelming abundance of a bustling market.
The goblins themselves are grotesque, part cat, part rat, part wombat. But the fruit they are selling represents a dangerous, forbidden temptation.
Lizzie, the cautious sister, knows this. When they hear the calls, Lizzie puts her fingers in her ears and runs away. But Laura is curious. She lingers. She decides she wants the fruit.
But she has no money. So the goblins tell her she can pay with a lock of her golden hair. She cuts it off, trades it, and gorges herself on the fruit. The language is intensely sensual. She sucks the juices until she's intoxicated.
But the next evening, the trap springs. Laura wants more fruit, but she discovers she can no longer hear the goblins. Only virgins can hear them. Once you've tasted the fruit, you are cut off.
Laura goes into a terrible, agonizing withdrawal. She begins to pine away. She ages rapidly. Her hair turns gray. She stops doing her chores, and she begins moving rapidly toward death.
This is a classic Victorian narrative trope, the fallen woman. The moral code of the era dictated that once a woman lost her purity, once she tasted forbidden fruit, society deemed her ruined.
The only acceptable narrative outcome for a fallen woman in Victorian literature was a tragic death. Right? Think of Fantine in Les Miserables, or basically any Dickens heroine who steps out of line.
But Christina Rossetti completely rewrites the script. When Laura is practically at death's door, Lizzie decides she cannot let her sister die. She takes a silver penny, marches down to the glen, and confronts the goblin men. Give me some fruit.
But the goblins are insulted by the money. They don't want commerce. They want corruption. They insist that Lizzie sit down and eat the fruit with them. When she refuses, they turn violently aggressive.
The assault scene is harrowing. They claw at her, they tear her clothes, they try to physically pry her mouth open and smash the fruit against her face.
But Lizzie stands like a rock. Rossetti compares her to a beacon left alone in a hoary, roaring sea. She endures the assault without ever opening her lips. The goblins finally give up in exhaustion, throw the money back, and vanish.
Lizzie runs all the way home, covered in the sticky, enchanted juices of the fruit. She bursts into the cottage and tells Laura to kiss her and suck the juices off her skin.
Laura does, but because it is now an act of sacrificial love rather than selfish indulgence, the juice acts as a violent antidote. It burns Laura like fire. She collapses into a fever, but she wakes up the next morning miraculously, completely cured. Her golden hair is restored. Her youth is back.
It is an unbelievable piece of literature because it operates on so many allegorical levels simultaneously.
If you look at it through a socioeconomic lens, the goblin men are predatory drug dealers, and the fruit is an addictive narcotic, like the opium that killed her brother's wife.
Or, from a feminist perspective, the goblins represent predatory, toxic men in the Victorian marriage market, who seduce innocent women, rob them of their chastity, symbolized by the golden hair, and then abandon them to ruin.
And you can also read it theologically. Lizzie endures a temptation and an assault to secure salvation for someone else. When she returns, she literally says, "Eat me, drink me, love me."
It is a deliberate echo of the Christian Eucharist. Lizzie acts as a Christ figure redeeming her fallen sister.
Yes, but what makes this uniquely radical is that in a strictly patriarchal society, the fallen woman is not doomed to the gutter, and she is not saved by a handsome prince or a benevolent father or a male priest.
She is saved entirely by the fierce, brave, physical solidarity of another woman. The poem ends years later with both sisters happily married, telling the story to their own children, ending with the famous lines, "For there is no friend like a sister in calm or stormy weather."
It is a stunning feminist subversion of the Victorian moral code. The pre-Raphaelites proved that art could challenge the deepest assumptions of society, but they still believed art had a profound meaning.
By the time we reach the end of the century, however, even that belief is shattered.
Which brings us to the final act of this era. We are moving from the mid-century into the 1890s, the fin de siècle.
Fin de siècle literally translates to end of the century, but it denotes a very specific cultural mood. It is a period characterized by deep exhaustion, decadence, and the total collapse of the old moral order.
The heavy moralistic duty of the mid-Victorians was entirely discarded. The new philosophy was aestheticism, summed up in the phrase, art for art's sake.
And if there is one human being who perfectly embodies that philosophy, it is Oscar Wilde.
He was brilliant, flamboyant, witty, and unapologetically arrogant. He dominated the London stage with comedies like The Importance of Being Earnest and shocked society with his dark novel The Picture of Dorian Gray.
He famously quipped that he put his genius into his life and only his talent into his art.
Wilde deeply mistrusted systems, politics, and moralizing. He argued that art should exist solely to be beautiful. It should never try to teach a lesson or serve a social utility.
A beautiful vase doesn't need to justify its existence by holding water. It justifies itself by being beautiful.
But then, the real world crashes down on him. In 1895, at the absolute peak of his fame, Wilde's life spectacularly implodes.
He is arrested, subjected to 3 highly public, humiliating trials, and convicted of gross indecency due to his homosexual relationships. The toast of London society is stripped of everything and sentenced to 2 years of brutal, soul-crushing hard labor.
He spends the majority of that time in Reading jail. The conditions were horrific. The silent system, the treadmill starvation diets. It completely broke his health.
And it was out of this devastating, deeply unbeautiful experience that he wrote his final major work in 1896, shortly after his release, The Ballad of Reading Jail.
If you are studying this period, you have to understand this poem, because it represents the ultimate endpoint of the 19th century.
And the best way to understand the ideological shift it represents is to compare it directly to a poem written exactly a century earlier, at the dawn of the Romantic era, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, written in 1798.
This comparison is brilliant because it perfectly illustrates the collapse of the moral universe. Let's look at Coleridge first. In The Ancient Mariner, a sailor commits a senseless, arbitrary crime. He shoots an albatross, a bird of good omen.
For this sin, he is punished terribly by nature and by God. His crew dies, and he is condemned to a living death on the ocean.
Right. Sin is followed by severe punishment. But there is a mechanism for redemption. The mariner eventually looks over the side of the ship at the water snakes. He feels a sudden rush of love for God's creatures, and he blesses them.
The moment he does this, the albatross falls from his neck. He is able to pray. He has to do lifelong penance by telling his story. But the Christian framework of the universe holds up.
Sin leads to punishment, which leads to repentance, which results in grace and redemption.
The universe of 1798 has a moral order. Now, compare that to the universe of Wilde's Ballad of Reading Jail in 1896.
Wilde's poem is about a real event he witnessed in prison. A man, a royal horse guardsman, is condemned to be hanged for murdering the woman he loved. Wilde, acting as the narrator, is a fellow prisoner watching this man wait in the execution yard.
In Wilde's poem, the Christian framework completely fails. There is no redemption arc. The murderer doesn't achieve some state of spiritual grace. He doesn't bless the water snakes.
He just stares at the sky in stoic, hollow despair. And when he is executed, they throw his body into an unmarked grave filled with quicklime to dissolve his bones. There is no requiem, no salvation, just chemical erasure.
Furthermore, look at the community response. In Coleridge's poem, the crew curses the mariner because they recognize the objective, universal moral law he broke.
In Wilde's poem, the fellow prisoners don't curse the murderer. They deeply sympathize with him. They identify with his suffering because they see the state, the prison system, the laws of man as fundamentally more cruel and arbitrary than the crime itself.
Wilde depicts the prison system as an engine of pure evil. He writes about the horror of the guards with their leading shoes, the hypocritical chaplain, the cold-blooded governor. The moral center of authority has entirely collapsed.
The laws of society aren't an expression of divine justice. They are just mechanisms of torture.
The poem famously concludes with one of the most cynical, devastating truths ever written. Yet each man kills the thing he loves. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword.
It is a philosophy of total bleakness. He is arguing that human nature is inherently, unavoidably destructive. We cannot help but destroy what we cherish. Every act of love contains the seeds of violence.
And notice the profound irony of this entire situation. Oscar Wilde, the poster child for art's sake, the man who spent his entire career insisting that art should never have a social purpose, that it should never try to teach a moral lesson, ends his career writing a ballad that is a fiercely moral, deeply social protest against the horrors of the British penal system.
It is brilliant, and it is heartbreaking. He was forced to abandon his aesthetic detachment because the suffering he experienced and witnessed was too real, too urgent to be ignored. The beautiful, detached aesthetic movement crashed headfirst against the cold, hard stone of a prison wall.
The transition of the 19th century is complete. We have moved from the absolute, unshakable faith in progress, industry, and divine order at the Crystal Palace down into the dark, tangled, psychological ambiguities of Robert Browning, through the romantic and fiercely feminist rebellions of the pre-Raphaelites, and finally into a world where institutions are cruel, laws are arbitrary, and the only solidarity to be found is among the condemned in a prison yard.
You now have the complete roadmap. You understand not just the plots of these poems, but exactly why they were written. You understand the theological crises, the artistic rebellions, and the psychological mechanisms that these poets use to make sense of a society undergoing unprecedented traumatic change.
You are fully armed for that exam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. Think about your own life for a second. Think about your social media feeds, our politics, our technology.
It's a good comparison.
If the Victorian age started with the Crystal Palace, a building made entirely of glass that symbolized absolute transparency, total optimism, and a blind faith that human technology would solve all our problems, and it ended in Reading Jail, a windowless stone box of absolute human despair and broken systems, where exactly does our current era sit?
Are we currently building modern crystal palaces, assuming our algorithms and AI will automatically save us?
Or have we already realized the systems are broken and we are just busy decorating the walls of Reading Jail? Something to think about. See you on the next deep dive.